My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the Executive Director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity, and we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate the public on our findings. MUFON is really more just left of center, where we try to take a scientific approach by collecting the data first off, and then reviewing the data, investigating the data, and making sure that what we're seeing is actually something that's truly an unknown. We have 3,000 members worldwide. Many scientists, physicists, PhDs, metallurgists, biologists, all the way down to just the average citizen who really wants to get involved. Some of those have chosen to become field investigators, and they go through our field investigative training courses. They become part of the team in their state or country where they reside, and they actually get engaged in going out and meeting this phenomena head on. We receive about 500 to 1,000 reports per month from around the world. Field investigators will take the case, generally review it, try to come up with a hypothesis, checking star charts, and we'll go put an investigation in place to determine what exactly happened. We've recently formed a science review board, and that board is made up of scientists from around the United States and around the world to review some of our more significant cases and try to render an opinion on them. What we'd like to do is be more outbound, more outspoken in terms of the really true UFO cases. So MUFON is moving forward with this approach, and we'll be publishing papers in these different areas to allow the general public and even the scientific community to be able to be challenged by what we're finding. That's the strength of MUFON as an organization, is being really the truth seekers of the UFO field.
It is my pleasure right now to introduce our keynote speaker. He is a 24-time Emmy winner, a Mark Twain, Edward R. Murrow, and Peabody Award winner 2 times. He's the anchor of CBS KLAS TV in Las Vegas, and more importantly, he's the host of Coast to Coast twice a month. And he's our keynote speaker tonight. He will speak on Area 51. This is a very significant event. You think about breaking the story 25 years ago, it's almost like breaking the Roswell story, because nobody knew about Area 51. So our keynote speaker tonight, who's going to tell you about some unheard details and updates on Area 51, is George Knapp.
I'll tell you right at the outset, this gets better and funnier the more you drink. So feel free to visit your bartender back there and tip generously. I am very pleased to be back at MUFON, especially here in New Jersey. John didn't mention this. I'm very pleased to be back here, but John didn't mention it in the introduction, but I was born about 25 miles from here, south of here, in Woodbury, New Jersey. And not only do I still have family here, I mean I still have family here. They're up in front. I don't know how they got this front table, but well done. So let's get to it and have a little bit of fun. I mean, I have been covering this story for 25 years, so it's a lot to cram in, a lot of good stories, a lot of colorful characters, a couple of videos or two, and you might have to give me the hook here to get me to stop, because there's a lot of material to cover. The story we are here to review tonight has traveled all over the world many times, and I know it sounds preposterous on its face. The idea that some slightly off-kilter, nerdish guy in glasses could be hired into classified programs, even though his educational credentials are practically non-existent, his work history is sketchy, he's been discredited and dismissed by people he worked with and worked for. There's no way that this guy would ever be allowed access to top secret materials if we want to roll number one. No way he'd see classified files, no way, let alone that he would blow the whistle on some of the deepest, darkest secrets of all time. But of course, we do know that Edward Snowden really did work for the CIA and the NSA, even though he had no college degrees. He dropped out of high school. He dropped out of the military. He was working as a security guard right before he was hired by the CIA, and then later worked for private contractors for the NSA and was able to access the most sensitive information in the US government, which he subsequently leaked. Tonight, I'm here to talk about another slightly nerdish guy in glasses, a whistleblower named Bob Lazar. Is it fair to compare the two of these guys? Tonight, I'll take you step by step through this story to see if this comparison is valid. Both men worked on classified projects for spooky agencies. Both presumably were not qualified to be in those positions. Their personal lives were spotty, their educational credentials questionable. Both were very bright guys whose lack of formal credentials was not an impediment to getting them work in places that seemingly should be off limits. I think Bob Lazar's story, the one you're about to hear now, demonstrates that those three-letter agencies that are probably represented here in one of these tables will hire almost anyone if it means there's a better chance of getting the job done. That's the reason, for example, that CIA came to my hometown, Las Vegas, in the early 1960s to hire the mafia to kill Fidel Castro. It's why the CIA and DEA have made deals with drug cartels. It's why we've had on the government payroll scumbag dictators like Saddam Hussein and Manuel Noriega. It's why journalists and entertainers and others have been recruited over the decades to work for these agencies. They do what they need to do to get the job done. And they will make a deal with the devil if it means getting the job done and doing it well. It's now 25 years since I got sucked into the world of Area 51 and flying saucers and Bob Lazar, and I was pretty sure back in May of 1989 that this could be a somewhat explosive story, that it might make some waves for a while. I had no idea that I'd still be talking about it a quarter of a century later, that it would travel all over the world. I was pretty sure it was going to make some changes in Bob Lazar's life, maybe save his life, which is one of the reasons he came forward. And I guessed it was going to cause a little bit of a hubbub at the base itself. That's the place with no name. It's the place with many names. And we'll go over some of them. But I had no idea it was going to change my life in the ways that it has. And I mean, it has. I'm here, after all. Since the theme of this MUFON symposium this year is UFOs and the media, I thought we'd explore together how this story spread out, how it became a transcendent meme. The way in which the story spread, I think, would be by itself something that intelligence agencies would want to study, or sociologists or academics who look into media issues, information theory. I mean, it has been astonishing, at least from my end, and I have had a pretty good seat. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into it. I started as a journalist in Las Vegas back in 1981, mostly in television, but some in print and as John mentioned, radio. Over the years, I've covered pretty much every story you would expect somebody, a journalist in Las Vegas, to cover. A lot of organized crime, a lot of mob stories. Political corruption, we've got our share out there. Sex scandals, celebrity goofballs, environmental catastrophes, drought, the foreclosure crisis, drug dealers, gun runners, murders, bikers, fires, stick-ups, pot farmers, crack peddlers, scams, rip-offs, scumbags, boneheads, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And, along the way, I've broken some pretty good stories. I got a couple of awards here and there, and in my hometown, I was considered a fairly good reporter, mainstream guy. That is until 1989 when I went completely off the rails and started covering UFOs. I am sure that this is true for many of you. In my town, I'm the UFO guy, and I'll bet in your town, most of you are the UFO guy or UFO gal. In your families, somebody sees a flying saucer on television, oh, go tell crazy Uncle Bob about that UFO story. We're all the UFO guys. As with many of you and my fellow speakers who are here, Not a day goes by when I don't get calls from Iceland or Ecuador or an email from all points in between about some UFO sighting or flying saucer event. Everywhere I go in Las Vegas, I get stopped to talk about UFOs. I'm in the grocery store shopping. They stop and want to talk to me. I'm in a restaurant. I can't tell you how many times I'm sitting there at a booth and somebody will just slide on in while I'm eating and start talking about UFOs. I've had people stop me at the urinal. I'm at the urinal. Hey, man, I'm a little busy here. I'm not making that up. And they will ask me, do you really believe that UFO stuff? Is that for real? Are you on the level? And they don't care whether I believe it or not. What they want is they want to tell me their UFO story, what they saw. The level of interest in this stuff is amazing. For some reason, my colleagues in the media are not okay with this. They can't quite get their head around the fact that the public is so interested in this subject matter. It drives them crazy. The public whom they serve is deeply interested in the topic and can't get enough of it. That is not the case for journalists, and I don't really get it. I mean, it's a great subject, potentially the biggest story in the history of the world. Even if it weren't true, even if it was all a mass hallucination, that's one hell of a news story because it's been going on for so long. And besides, I hate to admit it, but it's a heck of a lot of fun to cover this stuff and chase it around the world. But to my colleagues, the folks here in this room, you're UFO buffs. You're UFO believers. Those are code words that journalists use to put UFO folks sort of in their place. It's a tool that they use. And those who don't believe, they're skeptics, they're scientists. You're buffs and believers. Well, I don't know about you, but I never thought of myself as a buff or believer. I don't think of myself as a UFO reporter. I'm a reporter who happens to be interested in UFOs. There's a difference. And I think it's a legitimate news story. And as I said, it's driven my colleagues in media just right up the wall. 25 years ago, I don't think they realized how far the interest spread. And when they saw me getting so much attention in Las Vegas and the ratings spike that come along with these UFO stories, it really pissed them off. When that story about Bob Lazar broke, oh my gosh, in general, my colleagues in the media think, that's the year I went nuts. I had broken other stories, and I'd been careful about them, and I tried to be careful in the same way with this story, but they didn't see it that way. I can't tell you how many times I have been pilloried by radio morning DJs. As soon as they run out of belch, barf, and fart jokes in the morning, they would take on UFOs. My friends at Nevada's largest newspaper, the Review Journal, have had a lot of fun at my expense. I've been featured in several editorial cartoons. I remember the first one I saw had me with a butterfly net. My ass looked as big as a wheelbarrow, and I was chasing a flying saucer. The second one they had, it was called The Marshmallow Head Chronicles was the title, and it showed a couple of extraterrestrial hitmen had come to Earth, and they had their ray guns. They were pointed at a couple of gasoline pumps at a gas station. And the line was, of course they are Earthmen, but which one is George Knapp? I think they were making fun of my stout frame or something. There was a series I did some years ago about alien abductions and some of the weird medical procedures that happen that are reported by abductees, and the newspaper had a headline. They called it Kidnapped by Aliens. Ha, 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 ha. Very funny. And because I had described some of the procedures, they dubbed me a grand mullah in the Church of Cosmic Proctology. There was a media critic who wrote a weekly column, and he wrote one time, he said, people are rushing at home at night to see George Knapp's UFO reports, not because they're interested in flying saucers, but because they want to be there to, quote, see it when George does the big crack up on screen. Will he go bull goose loony, his eyes going buggy and rolling free in their sockets? Will he crash and burn before our very eyes? Now, that's a quote. Now, it's funny stuff. And I figure, it kind of comes with the territory. I'm a public figure in Las Vegas. I'm not thin-skinned. I'm okay with it because I know the public is okay with it. I don't write news stories for other reporters. I don't care what they think. I write it for our listeners, our viewers, and the public. The part that bothers me is that so few of my colleagues did any work at all on the subject before they decided to write it all off, and me with it, before they joked and tittered or made wisecracks about Elvis and Bigfoot and tinfoil hats. They certainly never spent hundreds of hours sitting out there in the dark outside of Area 51, sitting in the dust in the desert, waiting for something to happen, trying to dodge security patrols, trying to keep from getting arrested or buzzed by helicopters. They haven't read the books or the documents or interviewed the witnesses, none of that stuff that you would do on any other story. And it drives me crazy. And I'm sure many of you feel the same way. They see all of us in this room as nuts. And while I think that that is totally unfair and generally inaccurate, we all know that sometimes it isn't. The fact is, and you know it's true, the subject does tend to attract a lot of people whose elevator doesn't go all the way to the top. And they make it a lot harder on all the rest of us. For the past 2 weeks, I've been getting these cell phone messages and emails from this lady who has been imploring me to get a protective order to fly her to Nevada because former CIA Director Admiral James Woolsey is tormenting her with mind control beam weapons that have forced her to have all kinds of sexual activity with Asian men that she doesn't know. Now, I'm not making this up. She figures if I have a lot of UFO connections at the government, maybe I can help her out and get the Admiral to back off. When I was first in this field, I had this lady who kept calling me up after she saw the Bob Lazar stories. I have got to talk to you. I've got some really important information. All right, fine. She shows up at the station. She's wearing this skimpy halter top and holding a kid who I later learned was her alien love child. And she, within 5 minutes of me meeting her, she's telling me the most intimate details about her sex life because it was while performing a certain act out on her front porch that she looked up and saw her first UFO. Eventually, I'm not making up one bit of this. Eventually, they beamed her up on board the ship. They had her in sort of a beauty queen lineup, and they told her to put on a bathing suit. And then she said, they told her to get breast implants. And this is the one part of the story I could believe because there was ample physical evidence staring me in the face. I have been pestered by this millionaire who is a transsexual abductee. Add that combination up. By a guy who says he's the twin brother of Jesus Christ, who's coming back. He says the aliens are bringing him back, and boy, are they mad. I had a guy who flew from Australia. He told me he used the last money he had to fly to Australia, from Australia to me, because he wanted me to use my juice at Area 51 to get the aliens to stop abducting him. It's a sad story, but that was true. I have received all kinds of letters from alleged aliens who say they're watching me. I've got alleged aliens sending me songs and poems that they've written. I got people who've made death threats and issued warnings to me from people who pretend to be government agents. I've had people say that I'm a government agent myself. It kind of comes with the territory. And as some of you may know, if you know about UFOs or have an interest in UFOs, suddenly that makes you an expert in every other weird thing that might come up. Beelzebub, you got a problem with demons? I get calls about it. You had an out-of-body experience, can't get back in? You can call George about it. Well, so major media folks, when it comes to the UFO story and Area 51 in particular, have taken a pass. And so be it. It's their loss. The story about Area 51 got out anyway. And I remember in the beginning, man, everybody made fun of it and made fun of me. But eventually, as we'll talk about, the whole world beat a path to Area 51's door. I mean, as John mentioned in the introduction, nobody had heard of Area 51 25 years ago. But they certainly know about it now. It is an oxymoron of the highest order, the world's best-known secret base. Can you be both? I guess so. A place famous for being so secretive that for decades, the government pretended it wasn't there, even though we can see satellite photos that show it's there. You can look over the hill and see it's there. No, it's not. You're imagining it. A place where constitutional protections do not apply, where environmental laws are exempted, where you can be shot just for entering. Area 51, the box, the ranch, the Watertown Strip, dreamland. You know, began in 1955, a location where the U-2 was first tested. They sent out a news release. I've got it with me, a copy of the news release that went to media. It said, "We're building a little facility. It's temporary. Be gone before you know it." And here it is, more than half a century later, it's still out there in a remote part of Nevada, 100 miles north of Las Vegas. Few people outside of our state, other than those who worked there or lived in the perimeter, had ever heard of it. And then that changed in 1987 when a guy named John Lear walked in the TV station. At that time, I produced a little public affairs show called On the Record. And it's one of those shows that airs at 6 o'clock in the morning on a weekend. You interview a county commissioner or a city councilman, and nobody watches it. And Lear came into the TV station to talk to my boss, a guy named Ned Day, my friend and mentor, who was sort of the premier muckraker of his era, investigative reporter, mob fighter, mob buster. And Lear had credibility with Ned Day for one simple reason. John, whatever you think of him now, and a friend of mine, by the way, Jeremy Corbell, who's here, is making a film about John. He has some crazy ideas, wild stuff. Regardless of that, at the time, John had a lot of credibility with us for a simple reason that he had helped us break a really important story, the existence of the F-117 fighter. John and fellow aviation watcher Jim Goodall would go out there with binoculars and cameras in the desert, and they had acquired enough information about the stealth fighter that they gave the story to Ned. He broke it. It went national. It went national so big that the FBI hauled Ned in and quizzed him about where he got the information. Anyway, so at the time, John had credibility with us. His father had invented the Learjet. John had run for the state senate. He wasn't quite as far out on the fringe as he is now. So he brought in this pile of UFO documents and dropped them on Ned's desk. And he said, "You got to take a look at this, Ned. This is the next big story." And Ned said, "I don't want anything to do with that. I don't believe it. It can be true. If it were true, I'd already know about it." And so he wouldn't do the story. I was eavesdropping at the time. I said, "Let me take a look at that stuff." And he dropped the pile of documents on my desk. I read it. I thought, well, that might be an interesting subject, something change of pace for this show On the Record. So I had John on. And all of a sudden, my phone started ringing with people who want to know, "Hey, what was the deal on that UFO guy? Are you going to have more on that?" And I had him on again, and I had him on a third time, and each time the response got bigger. And I'm wondering, what the heck is going on here? I didn't understand the way in which this touched the pulse of the public, but it did. And so I started reading up on it. And then that third show, John had hinted to me that he knew somebody who had just been hired at Area 51, or as it turns out, a place called S4. So May 1989, we have this shadowy silhouette interview with a guy named Dennis, not his real name. And it was just sort of circumstance that it happened. I was anchoring the 5 o'clock news at the time, and our regular scheduled guest bailed on us. I called Lear and said, "Hey, we need a fill-in. Do you think your saucer guy would do an interview?" And sure enough, he did. And you saw some of the footage there, a little bit of the preparation for that interview outside. And after this thing ran, everything was different for me, for Bob Lazar, and for Area 51. Let's roll a piece of this tape. Number 2.
I don't know. Sometimes I really do regret it, and I almost feel like apologizing to him, saying that, "I'm sorry I let things out. Can I have my job back?"
25 years after he was forever transformed into Bob the UFO guy, Bob Lazar says he regrets ever talking about flying saucers or a secret base in the Nevada desert or any of the things that made his name known all over the world.
There isn't a day I don't get emails, and I try and get this across to him. Look, I don't even want to talk about it anymore. Well, I don't believe the story. Great, pass it around. I really don't want you to, because it makes life difficult for me.
A quarter century ago, not many people outside of Nevada had ever heard of Area 51, the mysterious base 100 miles north of Las Vegas, a place the government said didn't exist. It was the location of choice for all manner of black projects, spy planes that were kept secret from the public.
And that's my driveway, that's Bob, that's Gene Huff, and Bob's wife Tracy and Chris, and we're just waiting there for 5 o'clock to roll around.
Former CIA pilot John Lear remembers the day that Area 51 became a household name.
Hi, John.
This is home video he shot as a KLAS news truck prepared to broadcast a live interview from Lear's home. Lazar was understandably nervous.
Yeah, he was nervous because he was putting it all out on the line there, and here he was going to, reveal all this secret that he'd signed, that he was going to never tell anybody.
It's not only a crime against the American people.
In the interview, Lazar's face was hidden, and he used a pseudonym, Dennis, which was the first name of his boss out in the desert.
Well, there's several, actually 9 flying saucers.
Lazar claimed he worked intermittently at a location called S4 south of Groom Lake, the main facility of Area 51. He said the hangars had been built into the side of a mountain disguised as desert, and inside were a set of 9 flying saucers. Months later, he revealed his identity to the world and said the technology he'd worked on was from somewhere else, that it was being taken apart to figure out how it worked. So that's the basic story. He said that he was hired by a company called EG&G, which is in fact the company that has always run Area 51 since the beginning. That it was done on behalf of the U.S. Navy, that he worked at a place called S4 south of Groom Lake, a place called Papoose Dry Lake Bed. He said these ships basically have an antimatter reactor. The fuel is something called element 115, which at the time that Bob said it didn't exist. It does now, in a form that I'll talk about a little bit later. He said that it could create, basically, it was able to create its own gravitational field, which means it bends space and time. And it actually could travel in no time at all from faraway worlds just by pointing this gravity amplifier at this location. And I know it's preposterous, it's outrageous, it's ridiculous. Who in the world could believe such tripe coming from a guy who has a really sketchy background like Bob? Turns out quite a few people believed it because the story exploded like a hydrogen bomb. It launched thousands of product lines. It made untold numbers of media appearances. The meme was on the loose. I'll show you in this video. Roll this one, number 3.
And the coup de grace, Area 51.
You could have just handed me a piece of a UFO from Area 51.
There's never been any spacecraft. There's no Area 51. There's no recovered spaceship.
Excuse me, Mr. President. That's not entirely accurate.
It would probably take an Indiana Jones-sized warehouse to stash all the pop culture references to Area 51, the oh-so-secret facility. The place that did not officially exist for decades is the rock star of military bases, literally. There's a rock band named Area 51 and another named Element 115, which is supposedly the fuel for flying saucers. There's an Area 51 video game, an Area 51 bar. What better way to unwind after a long day than a glass of Groom Lake red wine from the Ailey Inn? Maybe spend a few minutes staring at the paintings you picked up at the Area 51 art show, while perhaps listening to the Bob Lazar music video. The story that Bob Lazar told 25 years ago has gone around the world many times over.
When you get yourself in position...
And in the quarter century since then, the world has beaten a path to Area 51's door. Every major news organization in the world has written stories. The base has inspired documentaries and TV dramas. Dozens of books have been written, fiction and nonfiction, hundreds of news articles, many of them critical of Lazar and skeptical about his background. His tale launched 1,000 product lines, every trinket you can imagine, along with assorted businesses, a AAA baseball team, and the world's only extraterrestrial highway running right past the entrance to Groom Lake. President Obama recently made a point of publicly acknowledging Area 51.
What's really going on at Area 51?
And former President Bill Clinton told Jimmy Kimmel he'd looked into those stories about space aliens.
So first I had people go look at the records on Area 51 to make sure there was no alien down there.
Even the Kardashians have made a trek out into the desert.
That's a security guard.
Look how that story moved throughout the internet so quickly, and not just the internet, but news in itself. Like, it was in the first 48 hours after the broadcast, it was in Japan.
Back in Las Vegas for a visit, Lazar recalls why he came forward in the first place. He had traveled to the S4 base only a handful of times, but began to get scared.
I began to get worried in that, boy, they've given me all this classified information. They're not calling me anymore. They won't take my phone calls. And in the meantime, apparently they're deciding what to do with me.
Look how bright it's getting. Look at it now.
For a variety of personal reasons, Lazar couldn't keep the story to himself. He shared his tale with John Lear and Gene Huff. They and a few others made treks out to the outskirts of S4 because Lazar said he'd learned when the test flights of the saucer would take place. 3 weeks in a row, a glowing object appeared over the mountain.
Look how bright it's getting. Look at it now.
And just a few minutes ago, we saw one of the government extraterrestrial UFOs.
The time when Bob said there would be a test, there was a strange light jumping around in the sky above the location where he said it would be at the time and date he said it would be.
You know, here, the craft took off when I said it was taking off from past the mountain range, which was Papoose Lake, S4, south of Area 51, you know, in a restricted area. So it's not like anyone was out there with a model plane or anything. And, you know, flew around, did incredible maneuvers that impressed everybody to the point where we got scared and got behind a car, fearing the thing was going to explode. But really, how do you explain that?
It's bright right now.
So many products, I don't have time to list them all. I mean, they have regular tours there now. For a while, it was just catch as catch can, but they have regular tours that go out a couple times a week. I did a story on the air a couple of weeks ago about one driver wasn't paying attention, blew right past the signs, and was in a big bit of trouble there in a big hurry. They have an Area 51 brothel, a legal brothel, which works with the Bob Lazar story if you think about it. They have an Area 51 blow-up love doll. I don't know what sick dog needs that one. I was thinking to myself, man, I wish I had copyrighted this thing long back in 1989. I'd be calling in doing this by Skype from my island of Kauai or something. You know, I was thrilled when I saw President Clinton speak about UFOs. It was kind of cool that President Obama said that. You'll notice he made the comment about Area 51. First time a sitting president has acknowledged the base while he was honoring Shirley MacLaine. But when I saw that the Kardashians had visited Area 51, I thought, oh man, it's jumped the shark. That's it for the base. You saw at the end of that video the clip of the original footage of this saucer test flight that Lazar and John Lear and Gene Huff and others had witnessed. Not once, not twice. They went out 3 times in a row. Lazar knew when the test flights were going to take place. He knew where the test flights were going to take place. Officially, to this day, there is no base at Papoose Lake. There's nothing at Papoose Lake. In fact, there is no S4 anymore. We'll talk about that a little bit later. There's nothing there but a dry lake bed. So how did he know? You know, it's one of the points that we'll come back to. Let's roll number 4 here. I'll show you a freeze frame of this video. Somebody had done some enhancement of this. There's a whole video, but I couldn't get it to play earlier. But that's sort of a close-up of that craft that they saw. And they saw it 3 weeks in a row. Over the years, dozens of other people have taken similar images out there. Sombrero-shaped things, orbs and balls of light flying erratically. Some of these clearly are misidentifications of classified projects. I get that. And some of them are just wishful thinking. I get that too. But it sure seems like something that looks like flying saucers has been out there, and for a long time. I don't think it's there anymore, but it looks like a classic UFO. I don't know if you saw the announcement last year. The CIA announced Area 51 is real. Thank you, CIA, for acknowledging that. Hoop-de-friggin-do. We knew it was real. I mean, you could see it's real. People have been out there. They've taken photos. They've been arrested. Even though it was removed from maps in the 1970s, we've known it's been out there a long time. At the same time the CIA acknowledged, hey, Area 51 is real, we're coming clean with you, they said, by the way, the reason people have been having these stories about flying saucers out there is because you're misidentifying things that we're flying, U-2s and SR-71s. I don't even know where to start with that. It's similar to an earlier CIA release that tried to explain away all UFOs. You remember all those UFOs you were seeing in the 50s and 60s? Those were ours. They sent out a tweet to that effect a couple of weeks ago. That was us, they said. Very funny. Except for the fact it's total bullshit. I mean, U-2s and SR-71s don't look like flying saucers, not from any angle. They don't stop on a dime. They don't land in cornfields or in backyards. They don't fly straight up or straight down. They don't do any of that stuff. More importantly, The stories about saucers in the Nevada desert didn't come from people outside the base seeing things in the sky. They came from people inside the base who leaked the information out, and not just Bob Lazar, which brings us back to him. I'm not going to try to convince you that Bob's story is true. I can't. I wouldn't even try. It's up to you. I think most people have made up their mind one way or another. There's not many of us that are still on the fence. I do want to share with you two thoughts on this, though. One is my belief that it's kind of a moot point anyway, because the Area 51 story has kind of taken on a life of its own, whether we like it or not. Bob Lazar or not. It's kind of permanently etched into the public consciousness, for good or bad. It's kind of like it's independent of Lazar. It's kind of like a being that is suddenly self-aware. There was that tour group I mentioned in late May, that guy who blew through the sign. We have video of the whole thing. That's why it became a news story. And I was going through it, logging the tape, and the guy is telling stuff about Area 51. I'm shaking my head. He said, oh yeah, this is generally where the motherships come down. They're there all the time. And then the men in black patrol this area, and you got to watch out for them. And then it's 60 floors underground, and all this stuff that's just completely made up. I didn't even want to try to correct it. I don't even know where to start. This is a beast that is out of control in some ways. The second, it's a monster. I mean, the second point I want to make is that how we pursued this story as journalists. You know, people think, oh, well, you must have just done this for ratings. That's not how stuff works. That's not how we work. And this is not a lark of a decision, something that we made lightly as a ratings ploy. It did get ratings, and that was good, but this was, we thought about it and argued about it. We knew what was at risk. Not only my reputation, but the reputation of our entire news department, our news entity. So we tread lightly. We were careful. We covered our bases. I spent 8 months putting together those stories about Bob and tried to investigate every angle, find every supporting bit of material that I could, and there was quite a bit of it. I know it looks preposterous on its face, and if you were to tell somebody this story without any of the backup material, they'd laugh at you. But I'm not laughing. My friend and colleague Stan Friedman is not here tonight, and I regret that because he and I have had some spirited conversations about this over the years. Stan I give him credit for doing the legwork on the Bob Lazar story, but unfortunately, because he's so far out in front on it, he takes a lot of crap from people who are religiously believe in this thing and can't understand why he's cooperating with the evil secret government to keep it a secret. But Stan took it on. He followed up Bob's claimed credentials. He found out that contrary to what Bob had said, he did not have any records at MIT or Caltech. And I applaud Stan for that. I give him kudos for doing the work. Like Edward Snowden, though, the only college that Bob had was junior college. And he didn't finish. Both of those guys didn't finish. So is that case closed for Lazar, that he lied about his college credentials? He's a liar, so we can't believe anything that he said? Well, I would make the case that I give Stan credit for doing some of the legwork, but the fact is, in the very first story that we aired about Bob Lazar, I said he made these claims and we can't prove it. There's no one at those schools who remembers him. And I'll just tell you, the first time I ever spoke to MUFON, it was 24 years ago, when I was invited to speak about this for the first time. I said, I don't believe Bob Lazar did go to those schools. And it's really simple. He doesn't, you know how it was when you were in college, you had to take certain electives that have nothing to do with your major interest. Can you imagine Bob Lazar sitting through English Lit? Because I can't. I mean, I could see him taking science classes, electronics, and engineering, but to take the kind of courses you would need to get a degree, there's no way. I don't think he went to school. Yet I'm not ready to sort of toss him out, sort of the baby with the bathwater. I never believed necessarily that he went to school. For me, the key question was always, did he work at Los Alamos National Lab? Because that was part of his claim. I worked at Los Alamos National Lab as a physicist. I said, well, that should be easy enough to check out. I called the lab. They said, we never heard of him. So, Bob, you're not helping me here. We dug up a front-page newspaper of the Los Alamos Monitor that showed him on a front-page story pictures of him with a jet car he'd created, and it listed him as a Los Alamos physicist. That wasn't good enough. The lab said, we still don't have any records. Then I found a phone book with his name in it, and they said, we still don't have his any records on him. I pursued this for 3 years. I've got a stack of letters this big between me and Los Alamos Lab, and they still were denying it. I finally got onto a company called Kirkmeyer, which is a headhunter company. They recruit technical and scientific people and get them jobs at places like Los Alamos Lab. And they said, sure, we've got records on Bob Lazar. Yeah, we got him a job at Los Alamos, you bet. And then I said, can I get the records? Yeah, no problem. Thus started a 1-year back and forth with that company. They had promised the records, yeah, we're going to send them to you, and they never did, and then they denied ever having them. And the same thing with the lab. They finally, after 3 years, they coughed up an ID number for Bob. Yeah, he was here, but he was in non-classified work. I interviewed 5 people that work with him at Los Alamos who said he was in classified stuff, and more importantly, I went there. He took me in with my cameraman on a weekend. And it wasn't like he had never been there before. It was like a rabbit going through his own burrow. He knew all these buildings, the ins and outs of these buildings. He waved at the security guy at the front gate. We waved at people inside the buildings. He took me in to see this gigantic particle accelerator, one of the biggest in the world. We took video of it. I used him in those reports. I think he worked there. And it seems to me that if he worked at Los Alamos National Lab on classified projects, which is what his coworkers said he did, it is conceivable he could be hired to work out in the desert in Nevada, whether he's got a college degree or not. So I applaud those who do the work and say he never had a college degree, but for me, that doesn't end the story. And if Bob lied about his college credentials, would he be the first person to exaggerate his education to get a really cool job? Because I don't think so. There were other witnesses who came forward, and I'll talk a little bit about them. The part that's really hard to convey about that time is just how weird it was. And it's one of those kind of things where if you weren't there, it's really hard to get it. But man, I'm telling you, it was strange. After we broke that story, I mean, Bob had death threats, and he would call me up at night, and I'd go over to his house, and he was pacing around. There'd been a break-in. He's pacing around with an Uzi. They would break into his house and just move things around. He'd come home and the doors are open. There'd be things that he had on his blackboard that were erased. He had a particle accelerator with a piece of element 115 pointed at it. They would move that stuff around. He went to the gym with a friend of his. He was carrying a gun because he was paranoid. He and his friend go in. They leave the gun in the glove box of the car. They come out. The doors, both doors of the car are open. The glove box is open. The gun's laying on the front seat. It said people were messing with him, and they were messing with me. And I know they followed me around for a while because 2 of the guys who did it told me about it years later after they had quit working for this security company. Our phones were tapped, which, you know, that really ticks me off. I guess we're all used to it now because the NSA has all of us tapped, certainly everybody in this room. Yeah, it's too bad that we got used to it. But in those days, I weren't used to it. I had 6 different people. After we broke the story with Bob, my phone is ringing off the hook. People, questions about UFOs, but occasionally a couple of people who had information and wanted to tell me their part of the story. 6 people who offered on the phone to give me interviews, even if I blacked out their face, were visited one right after another. There was a tax guy who had done tax forms for a lot of the guys who worked at Nellis Air Force Base, high-ranking officers who had told him on an out-of-town trip about some recovered wreckage from a flying saucer that was out at Area 51. Just swore him to secrecy. So he told me about it. His name was Roy Byram. And after he agreed to do an interview with me, the very next day he gets visited by 2 guys who said they're from the Secret Service, and they had heard that he'd been making death threats against the president. And did he know he could go to prison for that? He thought that was related to our phone call. I had a lady who, a cop introduced me to her. She worked in our Clark County court system. She's still there, I think. And she had previously been a secretary for a defense contractor at the test site called Holmes and Narver, major defense contractor. And she sat in on a meeting, she said, with defense officials, Air Force officials, and this contractor. She was the stenographer. And in this meeting, she said that they talked about a recovered disc, an alien craft. And after they finished, they not only took the notes away from her, they took the ribbon out of the typewriter. It was an old-fashioned typewriter in those days, and swore her to secrecy. The cop hooked me up with her. I talked to her on the phone. She agreed to do an interview if I blacked out her face. Very next day, she gets a visit by these two guys who flashed a badge at her. They said, look, you're still subject to your security clearance. And I don't know how to say this. They said, well, we know you and your daughter do a lot of traveling back and forth, Las Vegas to LA. Let's just put it this way. There's a lot of desert out there and bad things can happen. This is serious. I'm not making this up. She was scared to death. 15, almost 20 years later, I figured I'll reach out to her again, see if she would be willing to talk about it now. She's still scared, wouldn't do it. I had an electrical engineer who used to work at my TV station, who moved to Seattle, who had worked at Area 51 and had seen a saucer-shaped craft under a tarp in a building out there, and he agreed to tell me about it. And the next day after that phone call, where he agreed to do a silhouette interview, there's two guys sitting in a car outside of his house, and they're crew cuts, talking into a radio. They follow him to work. When he gets out of work, they followed him home. Somebody was listening. He was intimidated, and I don't blame him. And that happened a lot. Listening to phones, following us around, break-ins, it was a really weird time. And if you weren't there, it's really hard to convey it. As I mentioned, a lot of other witnesses came forward. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are a couple of key ones that I want to touch on. One was he was a spotter at the Nevada test site. His name was Glenn Pace. And in the days of the above-ground testing program, he was one of the only guys on the test site that was allowed to have binoculars. And he worked for a physicist named Otto Kraus, he said, and they would sit in a place called Area 15, which is above the area looking down on Papoose Lake. And he said they used to see these saucers buzzing around Papoose Lake, flying around down there in the 1960s, maybe into the 70s. I can't remember the exact date. Told me that story. There was another guy who I first told MUFON about it the second time I was here to talk about Area 51. It might have been 20 years ago. A guy I had stalked, basically. I had figured out that he was in a position to know this stuff based on his employment record. And I would go to these public events where he would show up and sort of ingratiate myself. He was from a prominent Nevada family, and eventually he invited me to his home, and he said, you want to see my scrapbooks? Yeah, great, good. He's showing me these books, this atomic test, and this guy and that, and then he stops and he closes the book and he goes, this is not what you want to talk about, is it? I said, no, it is not. And his wife walked in, oh, don't tell him that stuff. But he did, and over the course of the next 2 years, he told me a lot. And as I reported some years ago to this group, he told me that they had an alien out there that they'd captured, that they had several craft. They had been at a place called Indian Springs, which is now Creech Air Force Base, and it was moved later to Area 51 when that base was created. He said that they had it alive. He had kidded me. I couldn't take notes. I couldn't write anything down. I'd have to leave these meetings and then write furiously after the meetings everything I could remember. But he had told me at the time that this being looked just like a politician of the day, and it turns out he was talking about Ross Perot, a little tiny jug-eared alien. Anyway, I made a deal because this guy was a prominent family. I knew other people in his family. He had told them the same story, and we made a deal where he was going to make a videotape and give it to me after his passing. He's still alive. But he's complicated matters because he was told after about 2 years of us talking, he said, I got to stop. I was told to stop. Who told you? Well, my former employers told me to stop. And then the last time I saw him, he added a little twist to the story. It was no longer aliens. He was leading me in another direction. Well, imagine my surprise when a book comes out called Area 51 by a lady named Annie Jacobson. Any of you read that? It's a great history about Area 51, and it has a chapter at the end that it's a really good book and good history about U2, SR-71, all that stuff. And then at the end, it has an interview with this old guy who tells a wacky and wild story about how all those UFO stories, it was the Roswell saucer was really something that the Russians sent over, created with Nazi technology, and the aliens inside these things were actually Jewish prisoners of war, concentration camp survivors. And that was the story this guy told. And Annie put it in her book. And it made the rest of the book irrelevant. and it poked a lot of fun at Area 51 and the whole story, made it all less serious. It's the same guy. And I'm not going to identify who he is because I made a promise that I wouldn't, but it's the same guy who had changed his story, which is troubling. Over the years, all kinds of people have come out of the woodwork to tell what they know about Area 51, and a lot of them just made it up. There was a guy named Bill Cooper who wrote a book called Behold a Pale Horse. It should be called Behold a Pail of Horse Shit, because we just made this stuff up. There was another guy named Dan Burrish, or Dan Crane he used to be. Now in the beginning, he was kind of an interesting guy, and I thought he might be onto something. But in the last 10 years or so, I've realized that it's a game. He's got a merry little band of pranksters. It's like a Dungeons and Dragons. They pretend that they're superheroes to save the world, and it's all made up. I've had people tell these stories about all the milk carton kids. That's where they go. They disappear, and they're taken to Area 51. They make alien hybrids out of them in these huge bubbling vats. False flag operations. We didn't go to the moon because it was all staged out there at Area 51. Look, that place is pretty interesting. You don't have to make up anything about it. Back to Bob. Again, it doesn't matter whether you believe him or not. But people who want to write him off because he doesn't have college credentials have to also come up with an explanation for how he knew stuff. How did he know about those tests? Some people have said, well, maybe somebody told him. Maybe he was, a janitor out there. Really? Can we keep our eye on the ball here? A guy just told us they were flying saucers. It turns out they were accurate. We've got it on video, and you're going to say I'm not going to believe the story because he doesn't have a degree from MIT? I think we're missing the important point there. He also knew about something called the OFI, the Office of Federal Investigation. He said he thought he had been investigated by the FBI, and it turns out it wasn't. He said, it turns out it's something called OFI. I said, there's no such thing. What are you talking about, OFI? Well, there really is an OFI. Office of Federal Investigation does background checks for people who work at the test site. I didn't know that, but it's true. He gave me the name of a guy named Mike Thigpen, who was an agent for the OFI, and sure enough, there really is a Mike Thigpen, and I tracked him down. He wouldn't talk to me. How did Bob know? How did he pass a polygraph test? Not fail, not sort of pass it, passed it. On all the major points that he says in his story. How did he do it? Papoose Lake, there's nothing there. If you look at satellite photos, though, at least the old ones, you can see there's a road that leads down there. Let's roll the video, the next little piece of video. It's just freeze frames. There's a guy named Jerry Freeman. He's an archaeologist, and he had an interest in the 49ers who had come across Nevada on their way to California. So he had a really great, that's him. If you want to just freeze that for a second, if you can. Jerry, in the 1990s, had a harebrained idea to walk across the test site, which he did. He sneaked in from the west side heading east, which is pretty smart because nobody would think anyone's crazy enough to walk across that hellhole by themselves. He walked at night and hid during the day and walked all the way across it, all the way to Papoose Lake, where he found some inscriptions in rocks that the 49ers had left, and he took photos. And he told a story while he's out there hiding in the desert at night, trying to avoid being caught. He's sitting there in the middle of nowhere, and a door opened up. A door of light in the middle of nowhere. And people came in and out, and then it closed and it was gone. What the heck is that? If you only had one person to tell that story, I suppose you'd have to take it with a grain of salt, but there's more than one. There's a guy named Jim Goodall. I mentioned him earlier as a colleague of John Lear's. He's part of a group called the Interceptors. They used to go out to Area 51 and Area 52, the Tonopah test range, and take pictures of advanced airplanes. He's not a UFO guy. He's written a couple of books about stealth technology. He has great sources in the aerospace industry. He met Bob Lazar prior to Bob going to work at S4. And as he related to me, Bob had told him, I hate UFOs. I feel sorry for John Lear. It's goofy, it's crazy. I don't believe it unless I can hold it in my hand and see it. And of course, after Bob went to work out there, his story changed. After Goodall hears this story from Lazar, he starts asking his contacts, and he has a lot of them, about what might be going on at Papoose Lake. Let's roll number 6.
Did you ever get any information about a facility at Papoose, like the one you described?
I have a friend of mine, he's a retired senior master sergeant. He was early on in the F-117 program. And they had their badge, restricted area badge, he can go anywhere in the Nevada test site, up to and including Area 51. So they had a Humvee, and they drove around was it Groom Range? Yeah, Groom Range. And they're on Papoose Lake. There isn't anybody around, and all of a sudden, they're surrounded by guys in black uniforms, wanting to know, with their hands on their weapons, wanting to know who they were, what are you doing here? And my buddy said, we have some downtime, we're just exploring the area. He said, you turn around and you leave and don't come back.
They just kind of popped up out of nowhere?
He doesn't know where they came from. He didn't see any vehicles. All of a sudden, they were there. And he left. There was 3 or 4 guys with him. They left.
What do you make of that? That there might be something at Papoose, or was, or?
Well, according to Bob, that's where the 9 hangarettes are, camouflaged in the side of the mountain.
One other little tidbit of information that I'll share with you about sources. It comes from Jeremy Corbell, a friend of mine I mentioned, who's shooting some video tonight and who's been working on that project with John Lear. He's also the guy that did the video on Stephen Bassett's citizen disclosure hearings in Washington, and he also interviewed, with Linda Howell's help, a guy known as Anonymous, an old guy who did an interview with his face on camera, didn't use his real name. This came out last year, talking about Area 51 and Eisenhower's plans to invade the place and take it over. I have this guy in my gray basket. But as part of that work, Jeremy has been traveling some really interesting places and has developed some pretty interesting high-level military contacts. And he was at my house and told me about a couple of them. And I said, well, just go ahead and record it. So we'll play 7, and then we'll about wrap up.
Everybody's focused on Area 51. We know the great things that were achieved at Area 51. It's a shell game. It's a sleight of hand. We're talking about S4.
Right.
It's been confirmed to you directly from the base, maybe 25
years ago, yeah.
S4 has been confirmed to me directly twice. One from an employee of EG&G. Security was daunting. And then somebody else who's confirmed to me S4 that that's exactly how it looks.
The story, though, is that there was a facility like that at Papoose?
There is a facility like that at Papoose. Flying discs, not this UFO term that's created to make it ambiguous, flying discs, saucers, that were piloted by non-humans. They were not ours, and this was confirmed by both of my sources, that this technology is not ours. Bob Lazar's story was confirmed to me by those 2 same sources. One saying that when he was working in secret capacity at White Sands in 1989, that it was common knowledge at the base about Bob's story. And I said, well, what was the believability, the general believability? And he said, everybody knew that what was going on out there were with these types of projects, and they all believed Bob's story.
And were they following it as it's unfolding in 1989?
That was the impression that I got, was that it was big news. If you ever see it, it is not ours. And I said, not ours like America? And he says, not ours like humans.
While Jeremy was there, we were curious, because 25 years ago when I started this stuff, I called Nellis Air Force Base and I said, do you have a place called S4? They said, just a second, hold on. Yes, we do. I said, do you have more than one? They said, yes, we do. I said, can you tell me what goes on there? They said, classified work. What kind? We can't tell you. This is their public information office. Yes, we have an S4. Yes, it's real. They confirmed it. How Lazar knew about it, I don't know. So when Jeremy was most recently in Las Vegas, we called him again. I just was curious what they would say. Let me get back to you on that. And they called back and left a message that said, and they was really careful how they parsed this language. It said, we called the range people. They can't find it on any maps, which, of course, it was never on a map to begin with, which is, I just thought it was really interesting, the language they used to describe it. One last person I'll tell you about, and then we'll end this with Bob. And this guy's name is Ben Rich. And if you know anything about the aerospace industry, you know Lockheed, Skunk Works, they developed the U-2, the SR-71, the greatest airplanes ever built, the A-12, the F-117. Ben Rich, before he died, he'd expressed to close friends an interest in UFOs, and he said, UFOs are real, both kinds. UFOs from out there and unfunded opportunities. And before he died, on his deathbed, he told Jim Goodall and a couple of other people I think he even had it in LA in a public meeting. He said, we already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. Anything you can imagine, we already know how to do it. We have the technology to take ET home. No, it won't take someone's lifetime to do it. There was an error in the equations. We know what it is. We have the capability to travel to the stars, and we won't get there using chemical propulsion. Ben Rich was screaming in loud and big bloody letters and handwriting on the wall that we have some kind of technology that is way beyond anything you can imagine. Ben Rich is like the father of Area 51. Those are his babies out there. And for him to say that before he died, I give a lot of credence to it. So many crazy stories about that base. So many crazy stories about Bob Lazar. Bob is running a meth lab. Bob's running a string of hookers in South America. He's dead. There's a lot of, I get that about once a month. It's no wonder he's tried to leave this all behind. He only did these interviews with me because I've been bending his arm for a year. I tried to get him to come here. He said maybe, and then I couldn't get him to answer the phone after that. But I wanted to end with Bob talking about his life, what it's like today, why he wants nothing to do with this anymore. If we could roll number 8.
But that drives him crazy. I mean,
That's
you need
fine.
to answer this. Now, I need an answer. How many times do you get that in a week still after all this time?
I get, there isn't a day I don't get emails. And, I try and get this across to them. Look, I don't even want to talk about it anymore. Well, I don't believe the story. Great, pass it around. I really don't want you to, because it makes life difficult for me. I'm trying to do serious research. I've got contract with governments and other companies for R&D work, and aside from other scientific interests, and I want this divorced. Look, if I went and did everything I can to prove my story and reached a tipping point where people like Stanton Friedman and people along those lines said, you know what, this is beginning to look factual. Do you know how that would annihilate me? That would destroy my business. It would make it impossible for me to operate. And I'd have a continuous flow of questions, annoying people, I'm sure offers to do things that I am not the least bit interested in.
There's got to be part of you somewhere in there, even though it would be counterproductive. There's got to be part of you that wishes, God damn it, I know what happened, it's true.
No, look, I know what happened is true. There's no doubt, period. There's no delusion, and there are some things I can say that will bolster the case, and I'm not going to. It's going to stay that way. I do regret, at this point, bringing anything forward. Look, at the time, I'm in my early 20s. I went, you know what, this is a crime against the American people. This is just BS, and everybody deserves to know what's going on. And 25 years goes by, you get a little older, and your priorities change. And, what they told me is, this is a security matter, and really, what's the public going to do without this? You know how reactionary they are? There's a bunch of different reasons this is being kept quiet. Nothing that they'd bother telling me, but the bottom line is they're right. The bulk of the people are complete morons. And I'm sorry, maybe they are right. And this really should just be information that's handled out on a need-to-know basis to some people where it would benefit them.
He didn't mean that about here, the folks here. Bob's a smart guy, and I don't care if he went to MIT or not. He's a smart guy. A lot of it's self-taught, but I brought some other stuff. We'll have to show it another time. I want to wrap up, but about element 115, about the gravity amplifier, and he talks in technical terms. If you folks are technical, I'm not. You could appreciate it better than I can. It's an interesting story, and as I said, I don't think we're ever going to have an answer. They're never going to open up the hangar doors and say, there's the flying saucers, come on in and kick the tires or anything like that. I don't think they're ever going to admit it. I think probably if there were something like this out there at S4 or Area 51, it's long gone, because too many people have been out there over the years looking for it. Not only tens of thousands of people, but every major news organization in the world, congressional investigators. There's a lot of attention focused on Area 51. I've heard a lot of people say, Bob must have been working with him. Well, it's possible, but I'm telling you, it's not conscious. He wasn't consciously working for him. It could be that he was the perfect guy for this job. Let's pick somebody who's smart, who's technically capable, who thinks a little bit different, because we're not getting anywhere. We need new input. But we want to pick somebody who could be discredited if we need to. Let's pick somebody who we know will leak the story. Well, they picked the right guy there. If you know Bob, you know he has a penchant for hookers and machine guns and explosives and jet cars, and he has a pirate flag on his house, and he's an interesting character, and I would think he'd be the kind of guy who you could size up as he'll never keep this secret. We'll run it up the flagpole, we'll see how the public reacts, and then we'll yank it out from under him and discredit him, and that's sort of how it's played out. Jacques Vallée once told me, he said, I'm going to be really disappointed if the answer to the UFO mystery is merely people from other planets coming here in flying saucers, suggesting that the ultimate mystery is something much larger, much grander. And I've sort of moved on in my thinking over the 25 years since this all started, that I think he's right, is that, you know, I was focused on flying saucers, UFOs, and still am, but I think it's probably just a small part of a much bigger mystery, one that goes right to the heart of the nature of reality itself. I learned that sort of from this Skinwalker Ranch stuff, which we'll talk about some other time. Just that something is sort of playing with us. It seems to be some kind of a really steep learning curve, and we're only in the beginning of it. I get the feeling that we only understand a tiny sliver, and that the true nature is still kind of withheld from us. Maybe it's beyond the ability of our tiny brains to ever figure it out, but we have to try. You know, I'll end with this, as a saying that I've had before, is that it's the duty of journalists and scientists to investigate the unexplained, not to explain the uninvestigated. Thank you very much.
Educate the public on our findings.
MUFON is really more just left of center, where we try to take a scientific approach by collecting the data first off, and then reviewing the data, investigating the data, and making sure that what we're seeing is actually something that's truly an unknown.
We have 3,000 members worldwide. Many scientists, physicists, PhDs, metallurgists, biologists, all the way down to just the average citizen who really wants to get involved. Some of those have chosen to become field investigators, and they go through our field investigative training courses. They become part of the team in their state or country where they reside, and they actually get engaged in going out and meeting this phenomena head on. We receive about 500 to 1,000 reports per month from around the world. Field investigators will take the case, generally review it, try to come up with a hypothesis, checking star charts, and we'll go put an investigation in place to determine what exactly happened. We've recently formed a science review board, and that board is made up of scientists from around the United States and around the world to review some of our more significant cases and try to render an opinion on them. What we'd like to do is be more outbound, more outspoken in terms of the really true UFO cases. So MUFON is moving forward with this approach, and we'll be publishing papers in these different areas to allow the general public and even the scientific community to be able to be challenged by what we're finding. That's the strength of...
I'll tell you right at the outset, this gets better and funnier the more you drink. So feel free to visit your bartender back there and tip generously. I am very pleased to be back at MUFON, especially here in New Jersey. John didn't mention this. I'm very pleased to be back here, but John didn't mention it in the introduction, but I was born about 25 miles from here, south of here, in Woodbury, New Jersey. And not only do I still have family here, I mean I still have family here. They're up in front. I don't know how they got this front table, but well done. So let's get to it and have a little bit of fun. I mean, I have been covering this story for 25 years, so it's a lot to cram in, a lot of good stories, a lot of colorful characters, a couple of videos or two, and you might have to give me the hook here to get me to stop because there's a lot of material to cover. The story we are here to review tonight has traveled all over the world many times, and I know it sounds preposterous on its face. The idea that some slightly off-kilter, nerdish guy in glasses could be hired into classified programs, even though his educational credentials are practically non-existent, his work history is sketchy, he's been discredited and dismissed by people he worked with and worked for. There's no way that this guy would ever be allowed access to top secret materials if we want to roll number one. No way he'd see classified files, no way, let alone that he would blow the whistle on some of the deepest, darkest secrets of all time. But of course, we do know that Edward Snowden really did work for the CIA and the NSA, even though he had no college degrees, he dropped out of high school, he dropped out of the military, he was working as a security guard right before he was hired by the CIA, and then later worked for private contractors for the NSA and was able to access the most sensitive information in the US government, which he subsequently leaked. Tonight, I'm here to talk about another slightly nerdish guy in glasses, a whistleblower named Bob Lazar. Is it fair to compare the two of these guys? Tonight, I'll take you step by step through this story to see if this comparison is valid. Both men worked on classified projects for spooky agencies. Both presumably were not qualified to be in those positions. Their personal lives were spotty, their educational credentials questionable. Both were very bright guys whose lack of formal credentials was not an impediment to getting them work in places that seemingly should be off limits. I think Bob Lazar's story, the one you're about to hear now, demonstrates that those three-letter agencies that are probably represented here in one of these tables will hire almost anyone if it means there's a better chance of getting the job done.
MUFON as an organization is being really the truth seekers of the UFO field.
It is my pleasure right now to introduce our keynote speaker. He is a 24-time Emmy winner, a Mark Twain, Edward R. Murrow, and Peabody Award winner 2 times. He's the anchor of CBS KLAS TV in Las Vegas, and more importantly, he's the host of Coast to Coast twice a month. And he's our keynote speaker tonight. He will speak on Area 51. This is a very significant event. You think about breaking the story 25 years ago, it's almost like breaking the Roswell story because nobody knew about Area 51. So our keynote speaker tonight, who's going to tell you about some unheard details and updates on Area 51, is George Knapp.
My name is Jan Harzan. I'm the executive director for MUFON. We are a scientific research organization that basically collects sighting reports from the public and then goes and investigates them. Our mission statement as an organization is the scientific study of UFOs for the benefit of humanity. And we have three primary goals. We investigate UFO reports, we promote research into the UFO subject, and we educate